Hello everyone, today we will continue my short lecture series on how to write and how to grade an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Today I will cover so-called other criteria. These other criteria include what you see here listed on this slide. It's the relative weight of the single components. Remember our basic structure that we had here. Then a few remarks on sources, diversification of sources and so on, proper citation, although we will also have a separate talk on formal aspects as well. Then the whole issue of objectivity or neutrality, and then finally I'll show you how all this will be graded according to our standard grading form. So let's start with the relative weight of the single components. Relative weight means, well, in principle, what percentage of your text has been dedicated to certain crucial parts of your term paper. So it's not like, for this structure that I was showing you in the previous lectures, I have a clear idea on every single one of them. But in particular, two really matter, and I outlined this here. In principle, the whole logic behind this is form follows function. In other words, each part has as many pages as it needs, which might really vary greatly depending on what topic and research question you have actually chosen. This is why I used to be enormously reluctant to provide any percentage or page numbers or other indicators of an actual size, but since students kept pushing me, I thought that I would at least give you a rule of thumb, and please, this is really not more than that. 15% of total for those two components that I consider to be particularly crucial in terms of what their share is of the overall number of pages you've written, and that is the literature review and the analytical part. You remember when we talked about the analytical part, I said that students sometimes keep the harvest section, so to say, too short, and you really shouldn't do that. And in order to just repeat my point that this is important and that you should invest more time into this, 15% of total as, again, a rule of thumb. It could be shorter if you can accomplish what you need to accomplish in fewer pages using fewer space or a smaller share of the overall thing, and it could be more. And same goes for the literature review. You remember I told you for a master's thesis should be about 50 sources, more or less, again, depending on topic and research question. So I really want to see a thorough discussion here. So when I grade your term papers, master's thesis, and so on, I actually not just look at what you have written, but also kind of try to include this question of, is it really enough? Is this elaborate enough? Is the overall share in the thesis in a range that I would consider to be appropriate? And this is what is going to be graded here under relative weight of the single components. In terms of sources, again, our form follows function rule applies. So you use as many sources in your work as you need. That again might vary according to topic and research question. And what can also vary, of course, is the type of source that you use, and so on and so on. The one thing I really wanted to emphasize when it comes to type of source is that we are talking about a course at the university here, right? So this is an academic institution. So of course we expect you to use academic or scholarly resources or sources, and those are primarily books and journal articles. Now those are the main sources. I'm not saying that you should not use any other source. And if there is no book on a topic that you write about, well, obviously you can't use any books. But so again, this applies in principle, right? But then anyway, as a rule of thumb, I really want to see you using this kind of sources. I'm not really very excited about master's thesis on a relatively standard topic, consisting only of kind of online sources and newspaper articles and so on. Well, or actually, it's not that I'm not excited. I would clearly tell you this is not appropriate and ask you to write it again, being more academic. So that's the thing. It's a bit like what I talked about when in other aspects. There are various ways of doing things, And what I'm talking about here is about writing an EcoS term paper or master's thesis, which is taking place at a university. So I'm not saying that this is the way how you should always approach all your writings, but always consider the purpose that you have in back of your mind when you do this. And in this case, the purpose is to show your scholarly ability, and that means you have to use this kind of source. What's the quality of a source? Well, again, it's kind of a problematic term. Quality is, unless criteria are really strictly defined, is still in the eye of the beholder. When we talk about books, journal articles, I would look for books published in established university presses or with other academic publishers, because publishing as such is relatively easy. If you have the necessary amount of money, you can publish whatever you want. So the fact that something has been published as a book does not automatically speak for its quality, but especially academic publishing houses, they actually do have an editing board and editors who actually try to take care of the reputation of their publishing house. So they do select, they make choices, they do evaluate the quality of manuscripts that they receive, and usually they would also have a peer review process. Now, having been a scholar for almost 3 decades, I know about the pros and cons of the peer review process, not just in principle, but also in practice. I don't know how many books and articles I have reviewed myself, and I also remember how frustrating it can be being reviewed by somebody who clearly doesn't really know what he or she is doing. We all know about some issues in terms of friends reviewing friends. So, treating each other more favorably, or people just being lazy and doing a very superficial review or whatever, right? These things aside, still some kind of a check, an institutionalized check of quality is better than no quality check at all, right? That's the point here. So it's a bit like a democracy. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best system that we have. And right now, the peer review process is the best system we have. I really hope that something better will be found one day, because I'm not very happy about it. But as I just said, so far that's what we have to live with. So when we talk about journal articles, we also talk about peer-reviewed journals. And very often those journals are also listed in certain citation indexes. This is another indicator that they fulfill certain standards that have been set by the academic community. So please have an eye on that. Again, I'm not saying that you should use exclusively this kind of sources. You might use other sources as well, especially if you can argue that they are actually reliable and useful and so on. We talk about kind of a balance of all these various types of sources in your list of references, okay? Of course, the gold standard is primary materials, like not what others have written, but actual sources of data. Again, depending on your topic, this could, for example, be documents and archives. I've worked in archives many times, actually, find it quite exciting. Those are documents written by others, but they are treated as primary sources because usually you use them as the origin of kind of an idea or proof, or as proof of something. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Berlin in the Federal Archive and found photographs there, etc. So archives are actually a pretty rich source, and I think they should be utilized much more, because there are many treasures actually still waiting there to be discovered. Anyway, so that would be a primary material. Also, interviews that you conduct, that's data that you yourself create, is also a primary material, or a survey that you conduct. Now, in most cases, your surveys will not be representative because they just cost too much money. So on the methodology of surveying, that's a completely different story. But just to give you an idea of what is considered as primary materials, so they are also typically regarded as being of high quality. What do I mean by diversification of sources? Again, you see, it's like a mantra I'm repeating here. Form follows function. It really depends on your topic. I mean that you should use different types of sources. So try to include books and journal articles and working papers and primary sources and this and that and interviews and so on and so on. The more you diversify, the better it typically is, again, if this is possible and sensible, of course. By sources from different geographical areas, of course, I do not mean that you should use one book from every country in the world. That wouldn't really work. But what I mean is, especially since we are working on East Asia mostly, looking at East Asia only from an American perspective or from a European perspective is clearly not appropriate, right? And vice versa, looking at Japan only from a Japanese perspective would also not be complete. So you should try to include views from different geographical areas. Perhaps I should have said geopolitical or social areas or something. This is based on the assumption that where you are based as a scholar or as an author somehow influences your view. I understand that this perspective can be challenged, but nevertheless, for someone who is reading your publication, it will make a better impression if they see that you have tried to diversify your sources also according to place of origin. Right? It shows that you've tried to include potentially different opinions and biases based on the origin of the authors. Different languages, that goes in a similar direction, but it's not the same. For some fields, like my primary field of research, North Korean studies, it is absolutely crucial that you use sources in Korean, not because they are in Korean, but because actually very little has been translated into English, or I should change that from very little to not everything. In South Korea, there is a huge community of researchers writing about North Korea, sometimes really interesting and substantial stuff. It never makes it into the publications of Western scholars who don't read Korean. And that is a shame, right? So in a way, it is also demonstrating your ability, demonstrating your skill. This is not just for showing off, although, as I told you, this is also part of marketing your result. It is actually about telling the reader that you have been able to access all available sources of data, ideas, discussions, and so on. So especially we in the field of area studies, we usually say that one of our biggest strengths compared to colleagues more from disciplinary fields like economics, political science, and so on, our strength compared to them is that we actually have access to the country that we talk about or the region that we talk about, right? And access in this case includes, of course, knowing the language. And your ability to demonstrate that you have access is something that will definitely improve the quality of your work, but it will also improve your reputation in the eyes of your readers. So if you do speak in East Asian language, you know this is not a prerequisite for our program, but if you happen to be from Chinese studies, Japanese studies, Korean studies, or if you happen to speak Vietnamese or Filipino or something, then you join our program. You are strongly advised to also make the best out of the language that you acquired during your previous studies or in your life. By different languages, I do not mean German, English, Spanish, and Italian, although you're absolutely free to use those sources. But when you write a master's thesis completely based on English language sources, this is not really a big deal. Unless, again, you have a BA in Japanese studies, then I would ask, okay, why haven't you used any source in Japanese? But otherwise, that should be fine. But if it makes sense and if you have the ability, then I think you should apply that. By the way, Spanish, I mean, there's nothing wrong about Spanish. There is a certain gentleman in Spain who has some personal connection to North Korea. And if that person somehow is the object of your research, then of course it might make more sense to also read Spanish, because there might be information available on that person that so far hasn't made it into English. Okay, so I think you're getting the point. Different biases, if that applies. What does bias mean? Well, As you know, especially if you heard about critical theory, etc., we all are biased. Our views have been shaped by what we are and by how we've been brought up, by our systems of values, of the experiences that we made, and so on and so on. Sometimes even by coincidence, you know. So let's assume that everybody has a bias. And that's the reason why I put this point here. The best way to somehow try to neutralize the bias, which often isn't even known really, or can't at least be defined precisely. The best way to neutralize that is combining different biases. So they will hopefully somehow neutralize each other. That's the idea. For example, if you write about a controversy between party A and party B, surely you should use sources written by party A and written by party B, right? Not just party A and then decide, you know, on who is right and who is wrong. That wouldn't make sense, right? And the same goes for basically any topic where you have some different viewpoints, perhaps different schools of thought, and so on and so on. I also remember what I told you about sources from, for example, ministry web pages, right? You can clearly expect that they deliver a certain message to you, which is absolutely fine, but only relying on this kind of source would then mean that you basically carry that message into your work, which you shouldn't really do. So a diversification of sources also means including sources with a potentially different type of bias that would influence their selection of information and the way how they present it. So I have an example here, basically highlighting this, what I have just said, looking at the case of agricultural reform in Japan in the 1960s. I just made this up. So you would use sources from Japan, but also from outside of Japan. And then perhaps you could also work with outside Japan, so from East Asia and perhaps from the US and from Europe and so on. Sources by Japanese and by non-Japanese authors, sources in English and in Japanese. In this case, I think it would be really important actually to use sources in Japanese if you have the necessary ability. Sources by government officials, farmers, academics. Here we talk about different biases, right? Agricultural reform, assuming that an official is the one who comes up with the idea for reform, so it's kind of a sender. Then the farmers are more or less the receiver of the reform. I don't want to say victim, but people who are being reformed, right? So those are two obviously opposing positions, and you should clearly consider both of them. And academics in this example, assuming being kind of a neutral observer. Again, that's an assumption, but my point is to explain to you what I mean by diversification, right? So here you have at least three potentially different viewpoints, and as your supervisor or reading your paper or thesis, I would expect to see that you have tried to consider all those different viewpoints in your own research. Yes, and then you conduct interviews with farmers and officials to also see that you perhaps get a different information from what has been published, right? Sometimes in a personal discussion, you will learn points that never really make it into a publication. Proper citation, well, we are in a master's program here, so somehow I think this shouldn't really be such a big deal. Just let me remind you, and especially in the age of digitalization, there are continuously new types of sources, so there might indeed be some kind of insecurity about how to properly cite them. Go to the Chicago Manual of Style. You can Google it. There are things written about it. There are pages with examples, or you go directly to this URL that I've just included here on the slide. And they will show you exactly which types of citing you have, and what to put in italics and what to put in quotation marks, and whether to use a full stop or a comma or whatever. So it's all there nicely with examples. Just to remind you, make sure to pick one system of citation and then use it consistently. Don't mix different systems. That's not a good idea. Something very important, and I think I also mentioned that, also related especially to the introduction, all information that is not yours must be supplemented by a source. Obviously, that includes numbers, like China has over 1.3 billion inhabitants or citizens. If you write something like this, even though you assume everybody knows it anyway, I want to see a source here, because that's a master's thesis or term paper, and this is how scholars work. You can't really just claim this, okay? If you mention somebody else's arguments, like for example, China is expected to be the biggest global economy in 2050, I want to know where this expectation comes from. And also evaluations, like, normative, sometimes conclusions even, like China's human rights record is excellent. If you write a statement like this, I'm not going to doubt it or something, I'm just going to wonder where that comes from. And unless you can show me that you have worked on this field for 10 years and that you draw this conclusion from your own work, you actually have to prove that this is coming from somewhere. And if you then, for example, give me a Chinese government website as the source for this claim, then I might actually know why you have reached this conclusion. That's the whole point. It helps me to understand why you are using certain arguments, why you have arrived at certain arguments. And I'm pretty sure I would then also kind of question that. There's no doubt about it. But in order for me to be able to do so, I need to know where that information is actually coming from. And that's why you always have to provide a source for whatever strong argument information that you provide, okay? Page numbers, that's another thing. I really need to see page numbers, unless there are no page numbers. Like, for example, for websites, there are usually no page numbers, or if you refer to the whole work, like the book by whatever has been written in. I mean, there's no need to provide a page number in that book, but as soon as you take an argument out of that book, you have to provide a page number. There's also this topic of self-plagiarism. There is sometimes a bit of an insecurity amongst students, wondering, what is self-plagiarism and why should I be careful about it? Again, it's actually pretty simple once you understand the principle. The principle is that any published work is published work, and if you use it, you have to show that. And whether it's you who published that work or somebody else doesn't really matter. Treat yourself as just any other author. And then there is actually no risk of committing self-plagiarism. I put published work here in quotation marks because if you are in our program at the university, we would also count your former term papers, for example, as published work, or your former bachelor's thesis that you might have written even at another university. So when you are using work that you have done previously, you are very welcome. And I said in a different presentation, you also actually asked to include that, but not without mentioning the source, right? So you basically quote yourself then. There's also a certain rule of thumb that not more than 25% of what you've written previously should now be transferred to a new work that you are offering, either as a term paper or as a master's thesis. But otherwise, it's perfectly fine to use your own work. Just show that, and then you're going to be okay. Well, in terms of objectivity or neutrality, I will also have a short lecture on formal aspects, and there we will talk about the style of your thesis. So this would also be part of this in a way. In principle, try to be as neutral and as impartial as possible. Try not to be too much involved, or actually, it's fine if you're involved, but it shouldn't really show in your writing, okay? Let the logic, facts, and arguments speak, and let your readers decide which conclusions to draw from this in terms of normative conclusions, whether something is good or bad or whatever, okay? You are free, and as I said, actually more than welcome. I think it's even our duty to have an opinion on something. I mean, we are members of a society, we are no robots or something. You're human beings, of course you have an opinion. You're thinking people, and you are people with experiences and feelings. No problem with this. But the thing is, this should not be part of your academic work, okay? Well, it is anyway. I talked about bias. So by the very selection of your topic, you already kind of move in a certain direction that is shaped by your feelings, opinions, and previous experiences. But what we say, what we try to do is keeping this to a minimum, okay? And this is not just because it's kind of a high academic standard, but if you want to convince people of something, and let's remember that's the purpose of academic writing at the end of the day, huh? You have an argument, you have found something new, or you criticize an existing approach or something. So you always have kind of a goal in your mind. And if you want to convince people to believe you and convince them that you are right, in order to do so, trust is enormously important. And you will jeopardize the trust people have in you as an author if you let your opinion shine through too obviously. Or if you try to manipulate people. People hate being manipulated. You can manipulate them as much as you want as long as they don't notice. But once they notice, they will turn around 180 degrees and stop listening to you. And that's what you want to avoid. So try not to manipulate them in the first place. Be open, be transparent about your approach. Be open and transparent about your sources. And try not to say this paper is written to prove that Paektusan actually is owned by all Koreans because that's how it has always been and the Chinese are just occupying it or something. If people read this first sentence, they will continue reading if they already believe you, and if they do not believe you, they will stop reading, right? So, you know, your whole writing has been in vain, so please don't do this, okay? Minimize your bias. So language matters a lot in this regard. That's why the fourth point here on this slide is the avoidance of normative statements. Normative statements, either positive or negative, like, that was a good policy. No. Was it a policy that achieved its objectives? Yes, then it was an effective policy. Was it a policy that achieved its objectives with the minimum use of resources? Yes, then it was an efficient policy. But was it a good policy? I don't know. That's something that you should leave to your readers, and you shouldn't really work with this kind of terms or something. A brilliant decision. I don't know whether a decision was brilliant. Somebody else has to decide. Everybody has to decide for himself or for herself. It's not your job as a scholar to tell people that a certain decision was brilliant, right? And so on. I think you're getting my point here. A matter of trust, I already mentioned that, and you should perhaps also consider this problem of objectivity or neutrality when you choose a topic. Sometimes it's really great to be personally involved in a topic. It gives you lots of energy, strong motivation to follow through. For example, if you are a Korean living in Japan and you have experienced discrimination of Koreans in Japan, then well, obviously you have very good access to sources, you really know what you are writing about, and it will be difficult for you to run out of the actual motivation to continue and to complete your term paper or master's thesis. But then on the other hand, for exactly the same reasons, you might write this paper with a certain goal in mind, with a certain message that you want to send. And then you and I will have a debate about objectivity and neutrality. So perhaps for a term paper and a master's thesis, you should then write about a different topic. And then later, if you write an op-ed in a newspaper or magazine, then you can write about that and bring all your not just experience, but also personal feelings into that. But for academic writing, being too much emotionally involved is something that you should think about, right? It's a strong motivation, but there's also this danger that you might kind of drift away into a certain normative direction, and thereby you will lose the trust of your readers. And that should be avoided, because at the end of the day, it will not really serve your purpose, okay? So please keep this in mind. All right, and here just as a summary of what I just said, the grading according to our standard EcoS grading form, you see 2 or 3 points respectively for each of those aspects that we have just discussed. And yeah, that's it for today. Thank you very much again for your attention. If there's any questions, you know how to reach me, of course. And otherwise, I'm looking forward to seeing you again for another of my short presentations on the topic of writing an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Goodbye.